Nice to be here. This is my first time in Bulgaria, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. What I would like to do this morning is I would like to change your mind. And I don't mean that I'd like you to reverse a previously held position. I mean, I literally want to change your mind. I want to rewire your brain, make you look at something in a new way. And that might seem like a very grandiose ambition, to rewire your brain. But the truth is that we rewire our brains all the time, right? When somebody shows you something, and once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Right? You have your brain rewired to see that thing. Like the first time somebody shows you the arrow and the FedEx logo, and then every time you see a FedEx truck, who's seen the arrow and the FedEx logo, right? Most of them, right? Between the E and the F. Or what about Toblerone? You're all familiar with Toblerone chocolate, right? Familiar with the logo? Who's seen the bear in the logo? Oh, most of you seen the bear too, right? Okay. All right then. Consider the duck. Perfectly normal, ordinary, everyday duck. And then somebody, maybe on the internet, tells you that actually all ducks are wearing dog masks. All ducks actually wearing dog masks. And then when you see the same duck, now all you're seeing is the dog mask, right? Very trivial examples of having your brain rewired. Okay, your mind has been changed. There are, more important examples of having our brains rewired, like when Copernicus showed us the heliocentric model of the solar system, right? That the sun was at the center of our solar system rather than the Earth. That was a rewiring of our minds. Now, nothing actually changed in the solar system. The sun was always at the center of our solar system, and yet everything changed because our viewpoint of our place in the universe changed because of the Copernican model. Or when Charles Darwin finally published his beautiful theory of evolution by natural selection, nothing actually changed in the world. Natural selection had been carrying on for hundreds of thousands of years, but everything changed because our understanding of our place in the world changed, because our brains have been rewired. I love this, by the way. This is a little sketch from Darwin's notebook, where you can see the beginnings of the idea of natural selection beginning to take shape. I really like that. What it reminds me of is this, which is another beginning. This is a document called Information Management, a Proposal by Tim Berners-Lee, who's working at CERN. This is what would become the World Wide Web. This was the document that Tim Berners-Lee presented to his boss, saying, I want to work on this thing. And luckily for us, his boss said, okay. In fact, you can see what his boss said at the top of the document, where it says, vague but exciting. Luckily for us. And if you think about what the web was, it was also something that we kind of needed to rewire our brains for. This idea of this completely decentralized system, where you didn't have to ask permission to put a node onto the network. Right? We had to get our heads around the idea of the web, and then we had to get our heads around the idea of designing for the web, a completely new medium. And that was tricky. That was hard. Does anybody remember this book, Creating Killer Websites by David Siegel? Okay, Daniel does. We're showing our age here. This is a very old book. David Siegel is the guy who came up with the idea of using, say, spacer GIFs, right? 1 pixel by 1 pixel spacer GIF. You change the size of it, or using tables for layout. These were hacks, okay? These were absolutely hacks. But they were kind of necessary hacks, because at the time, that was the only way we could sort of design for the web. It's different now. Obviously, we've got CSS. Actually, years later, David Siegel recanted, and he wrote an essay saying, the web is broken and I broke it. Maybe overstating the case a little bit. But the idea behind this idea of creating killer websites where you could control the layout using tables and spaces, the idea was to try and enforce our idea of what good design is onto the web, killer websites. But the problem was we were taking our idea of what good design for the web is from a different medium, from print, for example, because that's where a lot of designers are coming from, right? Moving from print onto the web. Now, not everybody was thinking this way. John Alsop wrote a fantastic article called A Tao of Web Design. He wrote this in a list of art, and he wrote it 15 years ago. This article is 15 years old, And yet, if you go and read it today, it's even more relevant today than when it was first published. And he's simply making the point that we need to stop treating the web as though it's, print but on screens. Right? We need to embrace it as its own medium, a message I think holds very true today. And he points out that this isn't unusual, that whenever a new medium comes along, what we tend to do is take on what we know from a previous medium. So when radio came along, we started doing plays on the radio. And then when television came along, we started doing radio on television. And it always takes a while for every new medium to sort of create its own vocabulary. This is something that Scott McCloud talked about in his fantastic book, Understanding Comics, as well. Different medium, but he noticed exactly the same trend. We tend to take what we know from a previous medium and then apply it. It takes a while for the new medium to develop its own tropes. Now, where things started to change, I think, for the web was with the work of the Web Standards Project. We tend to remember the Web Standards Project for their work in trying to convince browser makers to implement standards, right? Trying to convince Microsoft and Netscape that they should implement CSS in their browsers. But that was only half of their work. The other half of the work of the Web Standards Project was convincing us. Right? It was convincing designers and developers that we should be using the standards. In other words, half of their work was trying to rewire our brains, right? To think about design and development on the web in a different way. And I know that some people literally had their brains rewired after reading books like this, right? Jeffrey Zeldin's Design with Web Standards. They thought one way before reading this book, and they thought a completely different way afterwards. The fundamental message that was in there, I guess, was changing the way that things were working before, where you had presentation and structure all tightly coupled in your HTML, and breaking that up so that you could have presentation separate from structure by having it in CSS. Fairly simple concept. And I think we could, we would have read about this, we would have maybe read articles, read books, and said, okay, I get it. You know what really rewired people's brains was when they saw this. Who's seen the CSS site garden? Okay, quite a few. You remember that aha moment? It's like, oh, okay, I get it now. It's the same underlying content, the same structure, and yet the presentation is completely different. Right? The CSS site garden was sort of a machine for rewiring our brains. And so we have these different layers when it comes to web development. HTML for structure, CSS for presentation, and then the final layer is that we have JavaScript for behavior. And this layered approach to web development is kind of what lies at the heart of this idea of progressive enhancement. That you would begin with one layer, your structure, you add on the presentation, you add on the behavior. I would like to illustrate progressive enhancement with this awesome tattoo from the upper back torso of my friend Lynn, who is really into web standards. Right, that we happen to have these technologies that match perfectly for these levels of the stack, right? Structure, presentation, behavior. Now this idea of progressive enhancement, it made a lot of sense back then. It's an idea that's over 10 years old. Some people think maybe it doesn't make as much sense these days, that it's an old idea. I think it makes more sense than ever. I think it's an idea that's more powerful now than even when it was first created. And this idea of treating web development in a layered fashion reminds me of something from the world of architecture, something I first read about in a book by Stuart Brand called How Buildings Learn. And it's this idea of shearing layers or paste layers, that you have different time scales operating. If you were creating a building, if you were creating a structure in the real world, you've got the site, right, where you're operating on a geological time scale. Then you've got the structure itself, and then you've got the walls, then you've got the stuff inside rooms, right? And his point was that things move at completely different time scales, so you can change the stuff inside a room on a daily basis, but you're not going to change the walls of a building maybe for a few years, and the site itself should remain fixed. And I think this maps pretty well to the web. When it comes to say what our site is, what we're building on, I guess that would be our URLs, right? That should be what's permanent, who URLs don't change. And once you get above that, the structure, well, that maps pretty nicely to HTML. Now, there's something in the design of HTML that's enormously powerful. Whether it was by design or just happens to be the way things have turned out as an accident of history, I'm not sure, but HTML is fault tolerant. And that's hugely powerful. I'll show you why. So here's the way that HTML works. got elements, and an element's made up of an opening and closing tag, right? You all know this. And generally, when a browser is confronted with an element, it shows whatever's between the opening and closing tags. And then it may do other stuff depending on its knowledge of that element. So this is what a browser does when confronted with an element that it understands. But what's really interesting is what a browser does when it's confronted with an element it doesn't understand. Or I should say, what's really interesting is what it doesn't do. It just displays the content in between the opening and closing tag. What it doesn't do is throw an error. What it doesn't do is stop parsing the HTML at this point and refuse to parse any further. That might seem like a trivial thing, but that's actually enormously powerful. That means that over time we've been able to add to HTML. We've been able to introduce new elements, knowing what the behavior will be, not just in browsers that understand the new elements, but also in older browsers that don't understand them. We know that older browsers will simply display the content in between the opening and closing tag. No errors. We can use this in the design of HTML. We can say, okay, in supporting browsers, I want you to not show the content in between the opening and closing tags. And then we know that older browsers will show the content, and we can put fallback content in there. That's a very deliberate design decision. The canvas element first came from Apple, and it was a self-closing tag. When it became standardized, we made sure there was an opening and closing tag, specifically so we could put that fallback content in between the opening and closing tags. Same with video. Same with audio, and now the picture element as well, this idea of having sort of nested layers of support within an element. So this fault-tolerant nature of HTML, I think, is massively powerful. It's allowed HTML to evolve over more than 20 years now. In some ways, you look at the HTML from back then, you know, a handful of tags that Tim Berners-Lee came up with, and you look at the HTML now, and they seem like completely different things, and yet it's an unbroken line. It's been evolving and changing over time. I still think of it as the same language, still HTML. What that means is that because it evolves over time and we get more fine-grained with HTML, that allows us a certain amount of structural honesty. This is another term from architecture. It's simply the idea that you're using the right tool for the job, essentially. Rather than having a facade, you're creating a sound structure. When we were using tables for layout, right, that was not structurally honest. That's not what a table is for. So an example of structural honesty in HTML would be, if you need a button, use a button element. Seems fairly straightforward, right? And yet, time and time again, I see people using things like stands or divs to create buttons, and then adding in event handlers, then adding in the aria rows, adding in all the styling to make it look and behave exactly like a button. You call me lazy, I would just use a button. And then we've got CSS for our presentation, which also has this fault-tolerant nature, okay? And again, that is enormously powerful for us. So stop and think for a minute about all of the websites out there that are using CSS, which at this point, pretty much all of them, right? Think of how varied they are. Think of how differently they behave. Think of how differently they look, how different their goals are. And then think about the fact that all of that CSS essentially boils down to one pattern. And it's this. All the CSS ever written is a selector, property, and value. That's pretty much it. We have some nice syntactic shooter for the machines, so they can understand what we're saying, but that's it. All of CSS is a selector, property, value. And again, what makes it powerful, in my mind, is what happens when a browser doesn't understand one of these things. If you give a browser a selector it doesn't understand, it'll skip over that whole rule block. It just won't execute whatever's in between the curly braces. Again, what's important here is what the browser doesn't do. The browser does not throw an error to the user. The browser does not stop parsing the CSS and refuse to parse the CSS any further. Likewise, you give it a property it doesn't understand, it just ignores that line. Same if you give it a value it doesn't understand. Doesn't throw an error, doesn't stop parsing. And that's hugely powerful. It means we've been able to evolve CSS over time. Keep adding in new things, safe in the knowledge that browsers, older browsers that don't understand the CSS will simply ignore what they don't know. And that allows us a sort of material honesty, right? Where we can, if we want rounded corners, we'll use CSS for rounded corners, rather than, slicing up an image and putting it into the four corners of an element just to get that rounded corner effect. This idea of material honesty is also something you get from architecture. So we have HTML, which has a structural honesty. We have CSS with its material honesty, growing over time. And then we have JavaScript for behavior. There's an important difference with JavaScript when it comes to this layered approach. And that JavaScript is not fault tolerant. Now, to be fair, I don't think it could or should be, really. Because whereas HTML and CSS are declarative languages, JavaScript's a programming language, a scripting language. And you kind of have to have rules, and you have to have some rules about what happens when you break those rules. So if you give a browser some JavaScript it doesn't understand, it will throw an error. Give a browser JavaScript it doesn't understand, it will stop parsing the JavaScript at that point and refuse to parse any further. Now that's okay as long as we're aware of that. What I mean is it's so important when we're building on the web to have safe defaults. To understand that JavaScript can be a bit riskier and to take care of it. So I'm not saying don't use JavaScript. Go ahead, I love JavaScript. I've written books on JavaScript. But I think we need to be careful how we use it. We use it to enhance, but we don't rely on it. Right? Because it is the most fragile layer of the stack, you don't want to put all of your eggs into one basket, one single point of failure. I like to think of JavaScript as being like the electricity of the web. Right? You want to turbocharge what you're building with JavaScript. But just as with real product design, you don't want to rely on electricity for core functionality, right? My friend Jake Archibald was riffing on the Mitch Hedberg joke about elevators and escalators and applied it to JavaScript. He said, when an elevator fails, it's useless. When an escalator fails, it becomes stairs. We should be building escalators, not elevators. I kind of like that. And yet, time and time again, I start seeing elevators on the web. This is Instagram.com, if something goes wrong with the JavaScript. There are many, many other examples. In fact, there's a whole Tumblr blog called Sci JavaScript that collects these. And it's easy for us to, laugh and point at these things. If you switch off JavaScript, the whole site just fails, completely falls over. But don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this is about people switching off JavaScript. That's a minute use case. In fact, browsers these days make it really, really hard for users to switch off JavaScript. Now, this isn't about JavaScript being switched off. This is just about anything going wrong. It could be on the programmer side, it could be on the user side, it could be on the network, it could be in the browser, it could be on the server. There's all these places where something can go wrong. If something goes wrong in the HTML, that's okay, it will recover. If something goes wrong in the CSS, it will recover. Fault tolerant. If something goes wrong in the JavaScript, that's it. It stops parsing at that point. One single mistake, it stops parsing. So this is an important thing about progressive enhancement. It's not about necessarily the technology not being supported, right? A browser that doesn't have JavaScript. It's not about that. It's about the stuff you can't foresee, right? Stuff failing in ways you can't predict. That's kind of the whole point. Is we don't know why the JavaScript failed. We don't know what went wrong. Whether it was an operator, whether it was on the browser side. Recently, last year, there was an ISP in the UK, Sky. And they had a blacklist of URLs that they blocked any requests from. And for some reason, code.jquery.com ended up on that blacklist. So anybody that was using that as a CDN, it didn't load. Now, depending on how you were using your jQuery, either that was okay, because things fell back gracefully, or it was disastrous, because nothing on your site loaded, depending on whether you're using progressive enhancement or not. So I think this, my colleague Andy King puts it nicely, that progressive enhancement is more about dealing with technology failing than technology not being supported. Or, as my other friend David Slade put it, it's simple. Build your apps so they aren't twirling shit show of clown horns when JavaScript breaks. More eloquently, Derek Featherstone puts it like this. This is in the web front-end stack, and that's HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and ARIA. If you can solve a problem with a simpler solution lower in the stack, you should. Less fragile, more foolproof, and it just works. Now, Derek is an accessibility guy, but here his argument isn't that it's the moral right thing to do to be supporting these people. He's saying it's just a more robust architectural solution to do it this way. And I think he's right. I mean, the best ARIA role is the one you never have to use because you're using the right HTML element that has that inbuilt semantic. If you're going to do animations, it kind of makes sense to do it in CSS rather than doing it in JavaScript, right? Always looking further down the stack for a more robust solution. So this isn't about universal access or anything like that. This is just about good engineering. And it makes good engineering sense to build in this layered, robust way. More foolproof, and it just works. And I think what all these people are saying about this layered approach to progressive enhancement is kind of a new take on a very old principle. And that's the robustness principle, also known as Pascal's law. I'm sure if you're from the programming world, you're probably familiar with this, right? Be conservative in what you send, be liberal in what you accept. Now, John Pascal, the godfather of the internet, he was referring to packet switching, in this case, designing networks. But I see Pascal's law in action all the time, in development and in design. Right? In UX, I see Pascal's law. Let's say you're designing a form. Well, you want to be conservative in what you send. You want to send as few form fields as possible to the end user, right? Just good design. But then when the user is inputting something into one of those form fields, you want to be liberal in what you accept. Don't make the user format their telephone numbers or credit card numbers with spaces or without spaces. Just take whatever they give you and work with it. That's the robustness principle in action, right? And I'm kind of into things like that. The robustness principle, Pascal's law. These are design principles. And I'm a huge fan of design principles. I kind of collect them. I think it's important that we acknowledge that when we're building something, we have beliefs, we have philosophies behind the things we're building, whether we intend to or not. So we might as well write them down and get rid of design principles. Anything built by human beings has design principles behind it. We can't help it. We tend to talk about opinionated software, but the truth is that all software is opinionated. And all software reflects some beliefs and biases of the human beings who made that software. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're using a desktop graphics tool like Photoshop to do web design. Now, to be fair, Photoshop was never intended for web design. It was intended for manipulating photographs, hence the name. Let's say, okay, I'm going to design a web page in Photoshop. You open up Photoshop, you make, say, new document, Command N, and the first thing it asks you for is a width and a height. Right? Now that comes from a different world. Right? This is like what John Alsop was talking about. We're taking on the tropes of a previous way of thinking, a previous way of designing. Now without realizing it, as a user of that piece of software, you're kind of taking on that thinking as well. If you're not aware of you being influenced by the software, which is itself influenced by the people who design that software. Or the complete other end of the scale. Let's say there's a content management system. And that content management system was made with certain assumptions about the kind of devices that will be accessing the content. And if a few years down the line, those assumptions about the kind of devices people will be using turn out not to be true, well, you've kind of tied yourself to the mast of those assumptions by using that CMS. And all software is opinionated. And that's okay as long as you find the software that matches your own principles, matches your own beliefs. And software is meant to be a tool. And if the tool matches the way that you think, you're going to work with it, right? The two of you will work together, will make you work faster. But if your principles clash with the software principles, you're just going to be fighting it the whole time. This is how it's possible that someone can have like a framework, and one bunch of developers can be saying, it sucks, and another bunch of developers can be saying about the same framework, it rocks, right? They're both right, they're both wrong, because it depends entirely on the person using it. And it depends on the principles embedded in that software. So in the front-end stack now, we've got a whole bunch of very powerful pieces of software that come with opinions, whether you realize it or not. I've kind of arranged some of these big monolithic JavaScript frameworks into sort of order of opinionatedness, right? Let's say I'm trying to build a progressive enhancement. I'm trying to build this layered approach. Well, Backbone, I could probably use it, because it's got a fairly light touch. It does URL routing, that's okay. Angular? Probably not. I mean, maybe I could use a subset of Angular to do some things, but Angular has a way of thinking. Right? Angular has an approach, the Angular way, and it works best when you adopt that way, when you take on the biases of Angular. And then never forget about it. That is unashamedly, unapologetically, no, everything's in JavaScript, right? I mean, if they didn't need the opening and closing body tag, they wouldn't have that in there. Just everything in JavaScript. And that's fine if you think that as well. But if you're trying to think in terms of progressive enhancement, a more robust engineering approach, and then also trying to use one of these tools, man, you're just going to be fighting it the whole way. And yet I see these tools getting more and more popular. And my worry is that people are using these tools without realizing what comes with them, without realizing the principles and philosophies that come with them. If you're using these tools and you totally understand and you're fine with the baggage that comes with them, right, that's been great. But stop and think about the tools you're using. I was listening to a podcast, the Shop Talk Show, and they had John Resnick on, who's the creator of jQuery, right? And they were asking him, why do you think these frameworks are getting so popular these days, considering that they come with, this overhead? And John said something I thought was really smart. He said, no one wants to think that what they're doing is trivial. That's quite powerful, because all of these frameworks are marketed as being extremely powerful things for people building complex things on the web, right? And no one likes to think that they're building something simple. And if you're at a cocktail party and you describe what you do to someone, and then they said, oh, right, that sounds pretty easy, you'd be insulted. But if you describe what you do to someone and they go, wow, that sounds like it's really hard. Yeah, it is. It is really hard, yeah. So everyone likes to think what they're building. So to be fair, a lot of what we are building is really hard. But I still think that this layered approach can scale up to these really hard problems. In fact, I think that's when that layered approach of question enhancement really works best, is on the really hard problems, right? Don't get me started with websites, web apps, and what's the definition of a web app, because I don't even want to go there. But not everyone feels this way. Now, Tom Dale, he's one of the creators of Ember. He's recently actually started talking about trying to make Ember work in a progressive enhancement kind of way. But a while back, he said this. He said, look, JavaScript is part of the web platform. Don't get to take it away and expect the web to work. No, I disagree with this, right, because of that layered approach. But part of the reason I disagree with it, part of the obvious, is his framing of the web. His framing of the web as the web platform. I think this is potentially a little harmful. Now, don't get me wrong, there's great people out there using this term. Webplatform.org, there's Web Platform Daily, great resources. But I think it's an example of political language. Political language where we can suddenly have our viewpoints altered without really understanding it, or without realizing it. Like in English, we have political language all the time. Obvious examples being collateral damage or friendly fire. Right? These are euphemisms that are obfuscating the real horror of what lies underneath. But there's more subtle political language. If politicians were about to have a debate on tax relief, well, before the debate has even begun, you framed tax as something you need relief from, right? Very subtle political language. And on the web, we've been guilty of political language in the past, and I think the web platform is an example of it. Now, I understand it as a marketing term, because it sounds great to talk about the web platform, but I don't think it's actively reflecting what the web is. So on the one hand, it's kind of great, because it sort of puts the web on its equal footing with other fully featured platforms. And that's kind of awesome. I mean, the fact that I can wake up in the morning and I say, I'm going to build something quite complex. Now, will I do it in iOS? Will I do it in Android? Or will I do it on the web? Right? The fact that that's even a question I can ask myself is amazing. And a few years ago, that question just wouldn't have even made sense. So on the one hand, yeah, that's great that the web is sort of starting to get on equal footing with some of these more powerful platforms. But let's not mistake the web for a platform. Think about what a platform is. Let's take something like Flash. If I build something, in the past, if I build something in Flash, and you have the Flash plugin, well, great, you get what I built. You get 100% of what I intended. The modern equivalent might be, if I build an iOS app, and you've got an iOS device, great, you get 100% of what I built. If you've got an Android device, you get 0%. If you've got a Windows Phone device, you get 0%, because you can't install an iOS app on an Android device. That's the way platforms work. It's binary, it's on or off, right? 0 or 100%. Now on the web, that's not the way it works. I build something on the web, and depending on your device, depending on your browser, you might get 100% of what I intend, you might get 95%, you might get 90%, but the important thing is, if you're building right, the end user won't get 0%, they get something. At the very least, they'll get HTML. Maybe they'll get some of that CSS, even if they don't get some of the JavaScript. So maybe they're getting 10, 15, 20% of what you intended. But that's what makes the web powerful, is that it is a continuum. It isn't binary, it isn't 0 or 100%. It's this continuum of possibilities. And thinking of the web as a platform is a category error. And just as web design is not print design ported onto the screen, then making complex apps on the web is not just software development ported to the web. There's definitely things we can learn from software development on genuine platforms that we could apply to the web, just as much we learn from print design that we could apply to the web. But let's not mistake the web as being a platform like any other. The web is not a platform. Joe Hewitt's a really smart guy, and yet he had this to say. when he's working on the web, he said it's hard not to be disappointed by HTML if you're developed for iOS, Windows, or other mature platforms, as I have. Now I totally understand his viewpoint. If you're trying to compare the web on that sort of scale, comparing it to genuine platforms, then of course you're going to be disappointed by what it can and can't do. What you're missing out is the reach of the web, the fact that the web can work on iOS or Windows or any other platform, right? You have to understand where Joe's frustration was coming from. What he was trying to do was he's trying to get smooth scrolling working on the web, right? And I agree, that is actually tougher than trying to do it in native, right? Windows, iOS. There's a whole bunch of interactions that are kind of tougher to do on the web. Right? They take more work. We don't get them out of the box. Swiping, scrolling, tapping, dragging. And we could get discouraged by this. But then I think what you've got to do is kind of look beneath these verbs and realize that these are all kind of surface level. Right? These are implementations. This is how somebody accomplishes something. It's not what somebody wants to accomplish. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm really looking forward to swiping, right? Instead, you kind of need to look below to the more semantic meaning of what people want. You get to verbs like this, right? People want to find stuff, they want to buy stuff, they want to publish stuff, share stuff. And then when you examine how you could achieve that, well, you can achieve that very low in the stack, right? Using HTML, using links, and using forms, you can get pretty far. And then you can use the electricity of the web, JavaScript, to enhance. And you can add on swiping, and tapping, and dragging, and all of those other implementations on top of that. Once you understand that, then this layered processing really makes sense, right? You begin with your content, you structure it, your presentation, your enhancements, and you realize there's no limit to where you can go with those enhancements. And maybe you can start to rival what you get in native, if the device and the browser is good enough for it. But what really good is that everybody gets to do the task. Everybody gets to do the fundamental task. And this is kind of a functional honesty. Right? In the same way that HTML has structural honesty, and CSS has this material honesty, we've got this functional honesty here by allowing people to accomplish their tasks, irrespective of the implementation level of it. I think responsive web design is something that's helped people get to really question what it is people want from this stuff, to stop thinking in terms of the web as being one rectangle that we're filling in. Instead, getting down to, well, what's the content? What's the most important content? What's the next most important content? And prioritizing that. In a way, if you think about responsive design, when it's done well, it's treating layout as an enhancement. Right? The idea that you have a grid is not something that's core, that's actually an enhancement to the content, to the tasks that people are trying to accomplish. And interestingly, responsive design is another term that came from architecture that Ethan Marcotte used to help sell this idea. And in a way, what Ethan was doing by coining this term responsive web design was rewiring our brains, changing our minds to accept an older idea, which is the idea of one web. You don't silo your content into separate domains for different kinds of devices. You have one URL, and you adapt the content for the capabilities of that device using progressive enhancement. So responsive design and progressive enhancement go really, really well together. I'll give you an example. This is the first website ever made. And this is how it looks in a small viewport. And this is how it looks in a slightly wider viewport. Slightly wider again, a bit wider, much wider screen. There's something to this, that this inherent fluidity, certainly with text on the web, is kind of baked in. We didn't have to work for this. There's no CSS here. CSS wasn't even invented at this point, and yet there's a responsiveness to it. And it's important to realize that the web is responsive on its own. Right? We've been the ones messing it up by adding in fixed widths, by trying to control things. Now, talking about the way you see things, rewiring great. Think about it this way. We often talk about trying to make a website responsive. But if web is already responsive, right? You make an HTML document, you put it online, it's responsive already. Then what we should really be saying is, how do I keep a website responsive? It's a different way of looking at it, sort of a different viewpoint. I think of accessibility the same way. People might talk about, how do I make this website accessible? But if you have a well-structured HTML document using the right elements, it is accessible. And then your question is, how do I not screw it up? Right? How do I keep it accessible as I start layering on CSS, JavaScript, right? Those other layers. It's a different way of looking at things. And And embracing this more robust, layered approach to building websites, it's kind of all dependent on a key question you have to be able to answer. And this is a question. Do websites need to look exactly the same in every browser? Now, fortunately, to help you answer this question, there's a website up there you can go to. It's made by Dan Cedamo. I'll give you the URL. It's do websites need to look exactly the same in every browser.com. And if you go to that URL, you will see the answer, which is a resounding no. But of course, depending on the device you're using and that device's CSS capabilities, the answer will look different, because that's okay. It doesn't need to look exactly the same in every browser. Now, I need to make sure that we're all on the same page here, so this is the only bit of audience participation I will ask for. I'm going to ask you this question, I hope you get the right answer. Do websites need to look exactly the same in every browser? No. Oh, it's just being a troll. We'll talk about this. You need to rewire your brain. Rewire your brain. Change your mind. Because honestly, if you accept this, then this, the scariness of all these different devices with all these different capabilities, right? Different levels of support for CSS, different levels of support for JavaScript, different screen sizes, right? Different processing speeds, which is scary right now. But if you accept that websites don't need to look the same in every browser, then it stops being scary. It starts being something you can embrace. No, seriously, it's a wonderful way to work. I'll be building a website, I'll go to the device lab, and I'll start looking at all these different devices, and I'll see, oh, this looks completely different in every device. Mission accomplished. If a website looks the same in a modern browser as it does in an older browser, you've probably got something wrong. That's not something to be proud of. I'll tell you an example. I'll show you a pattern from a responsive sort of viewpoint. This is a navigation pattern. I first saw it on this startup, BadChat, from Luca Bluski. So to get to navigation items, there's a trigger you can see at the top there. If you hit that trigger, you get the navigation. Now, all that's happening under the hood here is that this is at the bottom of the document, and that trigger was just a link to a fragment identifier, right, to an ID. Now, I really like this because this works everywhere. Literally every browser follows hyperlinks. That's kind of what browsers do, right? But you don't have to stop here. So I've used this pattern on sites myself. Have this trigger, it reveals the navigation. You could style it to look, like an overlay. You can style it to look however you want. CSS is great. But the important thing is that I don't have to stop here. Once I've got this, I now have a safe foundation. I know, okay, I've built something that works in 100% of web browsers. Now, how can I enhance it? So I was working on this little pilot project, a responsive pilot project for Kew Gardens in the UK. And there's a whole bunch of different navigation things that were going on. There's a search button that's going to reveal the search form. There's more links to the menu. So in each case, I use that pattern where I just put the navigation at the bottom of the document with an ID, and those three things are just links to those IDs. That works everywhere, okay? And at this point, you can say, well, now what will I do for more capable browsers? I can start to enhance it. So let's let that search appear from the top and swipe down. We can do that using JavaScript and CSS, no problem. Let's have a sort of progressive disclosure pattern for these more links, so that they're overlaid on top of the content instead of jumping to the bottom. We can do that. Just some positioning, CSS. For that menu on the side, let's have that nice off-canvas pattern. So it slides in, slides out. Fine. And if a browser doesn't get that enhancement, that's okay. They still get to accomplish their task, which is navigation, right? So nobody's being left behind here. Now, to do these enhancements, because I'm using JavaScript, and JavaScript isn't fault tolerant, I have to do a bit of feature detection. The guys over at the BBC have a lovely term for this. They call it cutting the mustard. This is where you're trying to figure out if the browser has enough capabilities to get the enhancements you're doing. So in the case of what I was doing there, I was using query selector, and I was using add event listener. So if a browser doesn't understand those things, I don't want them to try and execute that JavaScript, because the browser would throw an error. The browser would stop parsing the JavaScript and refuse to parse any further. So I just have an if statement, say if you understand these things, then great, go ahead and execute this JavaScript. There's two important things to notice in this pseudocode here. One, I'm feature detecting. I am not looking at user agent strings. Right? I'm not saying if you're Android or Safari, or if you're Chrome or Mozilla. I'm not trying to do that. There's some mud's game, right? It's a Red Queen arms race. Just don't go there. And query strings lie, right? Or user strings lie. So doing feature detection, not user agent detection. The second important thing to note here is that there is no else statement. There's an if statement. If you understand the stuff, you get the enhancement. Otherwise, and that's fine. Why is that fine? Because websites don't need to look the same in every browser. If you truly understand that, embrace that, then this is the way to work. And what that means is you get to start playing around with all of these different enhancements, the latest JavaScript APIs, the latest CSS enhancements, without having to worry about the older browsers, because websites do not need to look the same in every browser, and you built this solid foundation. Let me give you another example of something not being supported in a particular browser. Let's say you're using media queries, you're doing responsive design. When you're doing it responsively, so you begin with the structured content, and then your layout is an enhancement, right? So if you have a grid and wider screens, it's inside media queries. Well, an older browser, like say Internet Explorer 8, doesn't understand media queries. Okay, what do you do about Internet Explorer 8? How do you give Internet Explorer 8 the layout? You don't. Because websites do not need to look the same in every browser. Now let me check again. Do websites need to look the same in every browser? No. Not so certain now, are you? But I think this is what we should be doing. Aggressive enhancements. It's totally okay. If the browser doesn't get a feature, don't give them that feature. It's not okay to not let them do the fundamental task, right? Whether that's reading text on a screen, or buying, or finding, or sharing, or publishing. Make sure they can do that by using the lowest layer in the stack you can. But you don't need to try and make an older browser understand something that only works in a newer browser. Like I said, if you've got like an old version of Internet Explorer, and it looks exactly, your site looks the same in that as it does in the latest version of Chrome 70 jillion or whatever it is now, that's not good. That's not a good thing. And you're so proud of it. Oh, I came up with this great hack to make something work in an older browser. This great little polyfill that makes the older browser understand this new feature. That's not something to be proud of, right? But don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we should be locking out older browsers. Quite the opposite. With this approach, I'm saying we support every browser. I support Internet Explorer 8. I support Internet Explorer 7. I support Explorer 4. I support Netscape 3. There's a difference between support and optimization. I support every browser. I optimize for none. And our job is not to be building workarounds to make older browsers look the same as newer browsers. What a terrible waste of our time and our talent, right? And I know what you're going to say, you haven't met my boss. You haven't met my client. Oh yeah, I agree, I'm on board, but my boss insists that the website does need to look the same in IE 7 or something as it does in Chrome 70 jillion. And so off you go trying to make it look the same. You're now solving the wrong problem. Like I said, that's a waste of your time. If your boss or your client thinks that websites do need to look the same in every browser, then the problem to be solved there is rewiring their brains. The problem to be solved is changing their minds. And I get it. I get it that it's hard. In fact, I would say it's one of the hardest problems we have on the web today. Technologies are easy, right? HTML, CSS, JavaScript, we can master this stuff. You know, we figured out difficult problems before. We've got responsive images figured out. I mean, there's no limit to what we can do when it comes to technologies given enough time. But people are hard. Human beings are hard. I totally get it's going to be hard to rewire somebody's brain if they really believe that websites do need to look the same in every browser. But take comfort from the past. You know, when the Web Standards Project were trying to convince people to stop using tables for layout, start using CSS, it seemed crazy. It seemed like there's no way that was ever going to happen. Because changing people's minds seemed just so difficult. But we got there. We changed people's minds. We rewired our brains to see something differently. And that's what progressive enhancement is. A way of seeing the world. A way of seeing what we do on the web. And just as I said, it's not an old way of seeing that was useful 10 years ago. It's a way of seeing that's more useful now than it was then. There's an irony about this approach, was that the best way to be future-friendly is to be backwards compatible. If you're building with progressive enhancement, really think about the content structure and building up from there, you will be well positioned for future technologies that don't even exist today. Right? I talked about responsive design, seeing layout as an enhancement. Well, what about this idea of offline first, where the network itself is an enhancement? Or We're still thinking about screens, different size screens. What if screens are an enhancement? Right? Progressive enhancement will see you through this hard to navigate future. You know, I showed you the first website ever made, but I showed you it in a modern browser. It's kind of